So yes, welcome to 2 hours of dystopian surveillance and technology talk. Down the rabbit hole we go. We promise that it won't be quite as disturbing as a Black Mirror episode, but only by a little bit. So my name's Albert Fox Cahn. I'm the executive director and founder of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project at the Urban Justice Center. Long story short, we try to fight terrible, terrible technology. And in New York, there is no shortage of that. And for this first panel, we'll be talking about some of the ways that we're trying to fight the use of police surveillance through a bill called the Post Act, along with a number of other organizations and partners who are here to talk about that. So let me introduce the rest of the panel. Starting to my left is Brad Lander, a member of the City Council representing the 39th District in Brooklyn. Brad serves as the council's deputy leader for policy, and he also co-founded the council's Progressive Caucus. He's helped to bring participatory budgeting to New York City, and he has led the way towards a more just, equitable, and sustainable city. To Brad's immediate left is Laura Hecht-Felella. Laura is a George A. Katz Fellow at the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Program. Previously, Laura worked at Brooklyn Legal Services, where she represented low-income New Yorkers in litigation, seeking to prevent displacement and preserve affordable housing. She's a graduate of New York University School of Law. And to Laura's left is Saye Joseph, a migrant from St. Lucia, a young budding anarchist, policy nerd, and abolitionist working through a Black queer feminist lens. Saye is passionate about creating tangible steps to dismantling the carceral system and institutions that oppress Black communities. She also looks for opportunities to theorize and include in organizing and policy work a globalized lens when speaking about systems of oppression, so that we are more reflective of all Black people in the diaspora. So really excited to have this conversation, have such a wonderful array of perspectives on this. So just to start out, and this goes for anyone on the panel, we talk a lot about modern surveillance and high-tech surveillance, but let's take a step back and look at the history of surveillance. To you, what is the most important context when you think of where this history of surveillance begins?
Do you want to start?
Sure.
So I think for me, when I think about the history of surveillance, I think we could go all the way back to slavery. The entire institution of slavery was surveillance, slave patrols, slave notices, and then we moved through different generations of different reimaginations of what surveillance and monitoring look like. And when we get to New York in the 18th century, lantern laws was a form of surveillance that took place in New York. And what that basically was Black people had to carry lanterns, and if they were caught walking without a white person after sunset, then white people were deputized to incarcerate them or cause harm to them, because that's against the law for you to walk as a Black person without a light. So I think what's important to take from that history is the anti-Black, racist, anti-poor logic that underpins every form of surveillance that we see through history and every form of surveillance that we see now that's manifested itself. And I think that's an important context that we should hold, and an important framing we should hold when having these conversations around data, around algorithms, around predictive tools, around every form of surveillance and monitoring, is that logic that continues to manifest itself and underpin these mechanisms.
Thank you first, Albert, for having us here. My name's Laura, as Albert said. I'm from the Brennan Center, and we are a think tank that focuses on revitalizing democracy. And so when it comes to the Post Act, what that means is ensuring there's a proper flow of information between the government and people, ensuring that there's transparency in what the government is doing, particularly law enforcement. And so when I was thinking about kind of how to frame a big question like the history of surveillance in New York City, I think one of the things that's important to think about is who has historically been targeted by the surveillance. And as Saye was saying, it's historically communities of color, but not only, sorry, can't hear me. Okay. And in addition to communities of color, and within that community as well, activists and also religious communities like Muslim New Yorkers. The Museum of the City of New York has an exhibit right now on celebrating activism in New York City, and it's ironic that a lot of those groups that are being celebrated are the same groups that the NYPD has historically had targeted surveillance programs that they've been monitoring. So when you think about LGBT activists after Stonewall, the Black Lives Matter movement, anti-war protesters, those are all groups that we know the NYPD has targeted. And so I think it's really important when we think about what kind of surveillance has happened historically to think about who were the targets of that surveillance.
And I'm maybe going to continue from there because, and with a more sort of personal history, because for me, the work on the Post Act, which I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of, and the coalition behind it, is really a continuation of the work we did together to win the Community Safety Act in the wake of the joint crisis of discriminatory stop-and-frisk and discriminatory Muslim surveillance. And I was really thinking about this in the context of Bloomberg's presidential run, where rightly he faced a buzzsaw of criticism for stop-and-frisk, which he robustly deserved. But there was very little criticism of the surveillance of Muslim communities that was in the campaign for the Community Safety Act really united together. And I have to say that the fact that that coalition, that Communities United for Police Reform, was the broad coalition that included a lot of the people involved in STOP, in the Post Act, the Brennan Center, Malcolm X grassroots movement. But at its birth, it brought together activists fighting a racist stop-and-frisk policy and Muslim activists and allies fighting against NYPD surveillance of Muslim communities, which was just coming to light at that time. The fact that the NYPD had undercover officers go with Muslim Student Alliance canoe trips and was in a whole series of mosques and restaurants. People were just starting to know. I mean, obviously, folks on the ground knew, but it had not yet come to light. And the fact that those activists were able to form a coalition together, I certainly did not take for granted, because those are both hard issues that would be easy to demonize and were demonized in a lot of different ways. And to say, rather than keep those struggles separate, let's unite them, was a really big part of the power that they had to significantly decrease, not to end, but to dramatically decrease discriminatory stop and frisk, to bring to light, to end the demographics unit, to make it much harder for that unwarranted surveillance to continue, to win the creation of the NYPD Inspector General's office, and strengthen our bill against bias-based profiling. And I just think it's worth noticing that both stop and frisk and the demographics unit are forms of surveillance. They are less technology-based. Those are human forms of surveillance. There was this idea that even though we're not doing the kind of crime fighting, which is like, we think X person committed that crime, but instead we're gonna set a dragnet policy. There's guns out there, and we're going to use surveillance to go find them, and therefore we're going to target people to be stopped and frisked, like a form of surveillance, based on a kind of algorithmic logic, which overwhelmingly is discriminatory against people of color, in that case mostly African American and Latino young men, and target them for law enforcement with a surveillance goal, not with a specific "this is about a crime" goal. That's a form of discriminatory surveillance, and so was placing undercover officers in those student associations and mosques and restaurants. So even though those were leaned to human policing rather than technology policing, they were both kind of following this logic of like broad net, algorithmic, discriminatory policing in pursuit of an idea of public safety that was not warranted, was both unconstitutional and unwarranted. And this campaign really, to me, is a continuation of that set of efforts.
And I think that's a very helpful starting place for this discussion, because I completely agree that we often hear discussion of surveillance as something new, as something different, as something having to do with technology, but oftentimes it's the same power dynamics at play. Oftentimes it's the same systems in terms of the same entities, the same government actors who are pursuing a lot of these measures. So I do think those parallels are helpful. And to at the risk of shamelessly plugging, I would refer people to a Daily Beast article on Bloomberg's unwillingness to apologize for anti-Muslim surveillance that came out last November that lays out a lot of those parallels as well. So given that history and given how we got to where we are today, let's talk a bit more about what things actually look like on the ground. What are the sorts of surveillance systems that the NYPD is using?
I can start. So the Brennan Center released a chart in November of last year looking at some of the surveillance technologies that we know the NYPD has. And this was based on publicly available information, which means that there are a lot of gaps because there's a lot of things we don't know. Most of the information we have is from Freedom of Information requests that were submitted under New York state law or through investigative journalism or through court cases. But what we do know and what we can see is that the NYPD is one of the most technologically advanced police departments in the country, if not the most advanced. And some of the technologies they have, they seem to come out of a sci-fi movie. So they have X-ray vans, which can see through walls and cars to see what people are doing inside, private spaces, stingrays, which act like a cell phone tower and can connect with cell phones and determine locations of nearby phones. We don't know if the NYPD has the technology to see what's inside the contents of what's being transmitted through cell phones, but that technology does exist. And there's actually a lawsuit going on right now for people who were helping organize the Millions March and Movement for Black Lives believe that the NYPD was using this technology while they were organizing. We also know that the technology is pervasive. The NYPD's domain awareness system is extremely comprehensive. They have over 18,000 cameras throughout the city that record what's going on an everyday basis, and that's integrated with lots of other different data points, including license plate readers, which are located throughout the city as well. And it's aggregated, and we don't know exactly how the surveillance technologies are layered, but we know they exist. And we also know that the existing technologies reinforce a legacy of racialized policing in New York City. The NYPD engages in social media monitoring, and oftentimes that information they collect is used to justify inputting individuals into their gang databases. And the information they collect can be something like who someone's friends with online or what colors they're wearing, what kind of post they liked, and it's a very inexact science, but if someone's entered into that gang database, it can be used to justify arrests, which we've seen happen in Harlem and in the Bronx. There was a professor at CUNY Law, actually, who wrote a really great report called the Bronx 120 about this. And we know the gang database is 95% or more people of color. And I just would close by saying that a lot of times one theme throughout the different types of surveillance technology that NYPD uses is that they're oftentimes acting without any oversight. And this results in abuses, and then city council hearings where there's a long conversation about why this has gone on for so long. So recently there was a hearing about the NYPD's DNA database last week, and it turned out that through a bunch of different journalism reports and the work of advocates that the NYPD was operating completely outside of the existing state laws that exist to regulate DNA databases, collecting DNA from children who were not arrested or convicted of a crime even, and doing this all without a warrant. And then, of course, there's facial recognition, which has been a topic that we've talked about a lot. And there's been a lot of documented abuses with the NYPD's facial recognition software and inputting modified photos or inputting celebrity lookalikes into their system. So there's a lot of tools out there. We have some information, but one thing that the Post Act would do is provide the public with more information, and so that there would be a conversation on the front end rather than after a scandal or some kind of New York Times or other journalism, like front page story.
Yeah, I think this covers a lot of them in terms of like the gang database, the omnipresent high intensity lights that are placed in certain neighborhoods. And as the council member said, like NYPD itself, like in terms of stop and frisk, that was a form of like surveillance and monitoring, DNA dragnets, drones. And I think a lot of this does exist in like this opaque like system where you kind of only know if you're going through like the legal process. But what is the context that's framing these like systems of surveillance and tools is that this construct of like criminality and the ways in which you're able to label Black and brown people as criminal, therefore it's okay for you to maintain this like white heteronormative sense of public safety, and that's the ways in which you get people to like buy into like, well, it's okay because they're criminals, it's okay because they're gang members, and that notion of criminality is perpetuating these systems and making it okay. And this like false sense of public safety of like one group feels safe whilst another is surveilled, monitored, criminalized, and that is just like a divide on what public safety looks like. I think a lot of times it's helpful to have this conversation around surveillance of like when we talk about these systems and data sets and like the ways in which it's used, it's in the criminal context. And what we're really trying to get to for public safety is like everyone feels safe, and you can't say that by having a gang database just because one group of society feels safe but the other doesn't feel safe, because you could be put into that database that we're actually maintaining public safety. So it's like always important when our organization, Black Youth Project 100, talks about public safety, talks about surveillance, and talks about these data sets and predictive modeling. It's like we want to like separate the conversation around what's security and what's like safety, right? These databases don't keep us safe. These databases are security, and these securities are racist, anti-Black, anti-poor. So if we really want to talk about safety, like let's actually have this conversation, and I think that's like something that really is part of this as well.
So I'd love to build from that a little and try to offer a model that helps set the questions up of what we want oversight to look at and get at these questions. So were any of you at the thing that BetaNYC did at Industry City better part of a year ago, kind of connecting open data and transportation improvements? No. Okay. Yeah. All right. A couple of you. So I spoke there, and that was about the work I was doing, which now we've passed a law on, to create what was called, before it got amended, the Reckless Driving Accountability Act, and is now the Dangerous Vehicle Abatement Program. And part of what's interesting is, so here I am, on this panel as a strong supporter of the Post Act and the need to, for all the reasons we're talking about, have oversight of police technology for its discriminatory impact. But I'm also the sponsor of a law that just passed that uses a form of surveillance technology, red light cameras and school speed zone cameras, to identify the most reckless drivers, the most reckless vehicles out on our streets, for a policy to try to intervene in creating public safety. And I hope, like we spent a lot of time, we even reached out to Albert and other folks to say, help us make sure we're designing a program that genuinely has the question of safety in mind and not security. So our theory is, and there's good data to back it up, the vehicles that are operated the most recklessly are more likely to injure or kill other New Yorkers, and we should take an approach, a restorative and problem-solving one, to intervene with those drivers and do something to reduce their dangerous behavior before they injure or kill their neighbors, and that we can do that in a way that is not discriminatory, that has principles of restorative justice built in. So you've got a technology, the red light and school speed zone cameras. They are spread evenly throughout the city, and we need to keep an eye on that and make sure that they're not targeting one community or another. They catch people who run red lights and speed in school zones, and it turns out there's good data to suggest that those folks, first, they have already violated laws a bunch of times. You have to have run 5 red lights or 15 school zone violations, which honestly, in my opinion, is too high, but a good place to start. And so it's not only, there is data that suggests that's predictive of people who are much more likely to then be in harm-causing crashes that injure or kill New Yorkers, but it's also the case that you've already done something that we said you're not supposed to do, so it's not only predictive. And we then take a restorative approach. If you are one of the most reckless vehicle owners in this case, because we don't know whether you were driving or not driving the car, which we can get to in a minute, because actually that's your location, a whole set of issues. We are going to say to you, you are one of New York City's most reckless drivers. You need to stop doing that. Come take a course that has been shown to help people stop driving so recklessly, and if you'll do that, okay. And if you won't do that, then we're going to actually have to impound your vehicle because you can't keep using it like a weapon aimed at your neighbors. But it's not an arrest. The whole system is actually not operated by the NYPD. The cameras are operated by the Department of Transportation, and so are the classes. And if your car has to be towed, it's actually going to be the sheriff who impounds your car like you got parking tickets. So we think, and this will be a question to pay attention to over time, that we're setting up a system designed to increase public safety using technology with a system designed to protect people from harm in a problem-solving and restorative manner. But at every step along the way, there's things that you want to be paying attention to, because we've just seen how easy it is for these systems to slide into being discriminatory along lines of race and neighborhood and class, be about punishment and not about harm protection. And that's the set of questions we ought to be asking about all our surveillance technology. And currently, because we have no policy to do it, we don't ask them at all. And so the goal here really is, I sure understand the impulse of people to say, let's just not use them, right? And the places that have banned facial recognition technology, and we can talk more about it. But one thing at least we need is a framework for asking this set of questions, and you can only do that if you have a requirement that that technology has to be disclosed for starters, and then have the ability to bring this set of questions to it.
Yeah, and I do think that highlights a tension we've seen in a lot of these debates, that there's a big difference between the question of, should we use this form of surveillance, and should we have a public debate about this form of surveillance? Because there's a lot of different programs where we might not agree whether this program should go forward, whether it should be modified, but we would all agree that that debate is something that in a democratic society should be taking place in open hearings, that it should be something accessible to the communities that are being surveilled. Which I think is a great point at which to pivot to a discussion of the Post Act. I know we've been mentioning it a bunch, but we haven't actually told you what it does yet. So who would like to sort of take the lead in just explaining the mechanics of how the bill works?
I guess I can start on this one as a sponsor of it, although it wouldn't surprise me if other panelists had deeper insights into it than I do, since I'm not the prime sponsor. The prime sponsor is Vanessa Gibson, and it actually is a bill that last term Dan Garodnick, who was the council member from East Midtown and Stuytown, introduced. And I will say, if you know council member Garodnick, he is a he's not a radical, He's let's design good policy, and if anyone could work with the NYPD to reach a policy they could live with, it would be Dan Garodnick. And the fact that after a lot of effort, he was not able to get something the NYPD is willing to agree with, said to me, the NYPD is not going to agree to any policy of disclosing surveillance technology, and we are going to have to proceed. And if the mayor is going to defer to them and threaten to veto any bill, then we're going to have to move forward. The council's going to have to be willing to move forward, despite the fact that they are going to be implacably opposed to whatever we do. That said, this is about the lowest form of oversight that you could imagine having. There are places that have banned facial recognition technology. This does not ban anything. All this says is that the NYPD must disclose in a report to the council and the public the kinds of technology it is using. And that doesn't mean it has to say where they're located. There's a whole set of things that it doesn't have to say. It just is almost like think of it as like a little bit of a catalog. The things you just heard would have to be, here are the technologies that we are using. And even the language currently provides a lot of opportunities for them to not provide all kinds of information you might want to know about, how the decisions will be made, about exactly where they are, a whole set of things. It's just more like, a catalog of the technologies that the department is using.
Yeah, as Councilmember Lander said, it would be kind of the first step in creating broader oversight of what kind of technology the NYPD is using is just knowing what they're using. So the POST Act stands for the Public Oversight of Surveillance Technology Act. It has been around since 2017, and the Brennan Center has been involved since the very beginning of the campaign. It currently has 33 co-sponsors in the City Council, which is one away from a veto-proof majority. 8 of the 13 members on the Committee of Public Safety have signed on to sponsor the act. So there is a lot of momentum within the City Council and support. And as the council member was saying, it's very high-level transparency bill. It doesn't require granular details about what kind of technology the NYPD is using or where they're using it. Well, I just misspoke. It does require information about what kind of technologies they're using, but not where they're using it or how they're using it. It doesn't prohibit the NYPD from using any technologies, which is really important. And it doesn't disclose how the technologies intersect with each other, which is something that, again, is carefully balanced to protect the NYPD's ability to do their job, but also to ensure there's transparency for the public. The reports are published publicly, and then the public will have an opportunity to comment, and then the final reports will be published on the NYPD's website, which again is just providing more mechanisms for public oversight, for accountability, to have a conversation on the front end about the technologies rather than after a scandal. And also the POST Act has the Inspector General do an audit to see if the NYPD is complying with the reports that they're putting out.
Yeah, I think basically everything everyone said. This bill is like I think for us, feels like a very basic minimum. Like you want to know at least the bare minimum of the tools that NYPD is using to surveil and keep us safe. And I think other states like California completely ban, and people are having those conversations around ban. And this POST Act is just a basic what are the things that you're using? We're not asking, and it also has no teeth to it. So we're knowing, but we don't have. It's not giving anyone any teeth to say, well, you can't use this money to do this or not do this. It's just what are you using, when are you using it, and it's basically it. But yeah, I think it's just an important. I think it's an important bill to go through as we talk about open data and being transparent and how that builds community, just knowing the things and the ways in which our communities are being, I guess, watched. But if we're moving into this space of community policing, it's should be a no-brainer that there should be transparencies on both ends, not just this still maintaining this dynamic of power, you don't know what I'm using, but I want to know everything about you kind of thing, right? So it's a matter of just breaking those layers.
Yeah, I think there have been a few scandals that have shown why that sort of transparency is so important. As many of you may have heard, there's a private company called Clearview AI, which sold facial recognition products to police departments. And at first, the NYPD said, we never used the product. And then they said, okay, we had just a few trial accounts. And then it turned out in recent reporting that not only did they have more than a few accounts, they had actually run more than 11,000 searches, the most of any police department in the country. And there was nothing under existing state or city law that required them to tell anyone, to come up with a policy, and to say, okay, what happens to that data? What happens on the data for the people standing next to the person we wanted to photograph? What can we do with that data? Can we hold on to it? Can we retain it indefinitely? Can we share it with ICE? I mean, and especially as we talk about the collateral immigration consequences, these questions of data retention and data sharing take on even more significance. So it sounds like when we're putting it out there, when we're describing this bill, this seems like a slam dunk, a no-brainer. This is the easiest, most indispensable reform you could have. I assume the NYPD has agreed? Maybe you could tell us a bit about the sort of responses and rhetoric we've heard so far.
Well, the NYPD has come out very strongly against the Post Act, both in the hearing that was first held in 2017, and then they opposed the bill again in the recent hearing in December of 2019. A lot of their rhetoric has been to invoke September 11th and the risk of future terrorist attacks, and to argue that the Post Act would take away tools from their toolkit or give a roadmap to the quote-unquote bad guys. And then they've also pointed to existing guidelines that they follow, like the Honshu Agreement, which were created after there were court cases where individuals had to sue the NYPD for violations of their constitutional rights, and then guidelines were put in place to limit the kind of surveillance that NYPD can conduct. So their opposition is in large part, for lack of a better word, fear-mongering. I think that they're not looking at the Post Act in terms of what actually it would do, which is just to provide transparency, some information about what's going on, but not actually prevent the NYPD from using any tools. And I think it goes back to, again, this distinction between security and safety. The public deserves to have a conversation about what kind of tools they want law enforcement to use, and doing that is not going to make anyone less safe.
Yeah, I feel like at the hearing, they kind of made 3 moves. The main one in their testimony is just to tell the story of every example they can give about how intelligence work saved people's lives. You know, so they have a set of examples and incidents that they give where the NYPD did things that prevented mostly, terrorist incidents, but, from happening. And only some of those even involve using technology, truthfully, but they're really, none of them would have been, would have been changed by the Post Act. They really don't have anything to do with the Post Act. But that's like move 1, is just like imply that, society is only like a thin line, the thin blue line away from terrorist chaos. And if you put any additional regulations or restrictions on us, then that will break out. And like that's like a like a very traditional move anytime we try to do any kind of policing reform, but they sure did it here. They went with this kind of like long story. And I really wanted to read back the Enemies Within book. Some of you know Adam Goldman and Matt Apuzzo's book, which you should read if you haven't. It's like an extraordinary read about not only the discriminatory impacts of surveillance, but why it leads you in the wrong directions in terms of keeping folks safe. But so that's like move 1, which really, again, has nothing to do with the Post Act at all, but is just like a kind of rhetorical invocation of we know and you don't know and leave us alone. Then there's the sort of like bad guys will be able to bad guys will be able to use the catalog because if they know what brand of listening device we're using, they'll figure out how to rig the rooms, with some countering technology to those particular listening devices, which just seems really silly more than anything else. Like, if you are plotting to commit crimes, that the NYPD is probably, might well be trying to figure it out and stop you. And so, like, the idea that you wouldn't know that they might be using listening devices, so that's sort of move 2. And then move 3 is just like a kind of like, well, what's a surveillance technology? Every database that we have, so are all the computers of all the NYPD officers and that the department has part of the surveillance because they're where the gang database or the DNA database exists, and how could we know? Which also is just like, so fine, list the computers, like we have computers, guess what? Doesn't seem that hard. But those were the things mostly that they said in the hearing.
Yeah, I think the Post Act exists also in this like current climate around like just not current climate, but like politics. right? Like right now there is an effort to roll back bail, and like Republicans, Long Island Dems, and like police unions are at the forefront of that effort to roll back bail. And it's like, oh, police are under attack kind of rhetoric, right? And people fall into that, communities like really buy into that rhetoric, and post-act gets to be kind of in a similar way where police get to define, oh, this is an attack on police, right? Wanting to be transparent is an attack on police, and that rhetoric gets to kind of take all the energy and all the air up and all the space up. So I think for us at BYP 100, as we talk about the post-act, as we talk about surveillance, is like, yes, that narrative is going to exist. That's the narrative that's always existed around this police state, right? So for us, it's been a lot about, yes, that politics, but also community education. How can we really break down, like, what does surveillance mean? What does these things look like? The database, DNA dragnets, drones. And for us, one thing that's been really helpful as we talk to community about this, because community has power, they go to their precinct council meetings, they go to all these spaces, and they could show up to these community hearings. It's like explaining to community of like, we're investing all this money into these surveillance tools whilst your housing is falling apart. We don't have free transportation. Like that money could be going to this. So let's talk about that conversation and like push back against this fear mongering that we're getting from the police of like, we want transparency, but we also want to move the conversation further of like, we want oversight and the ability to say all this money should not be going to these surveillance tools. All this money should be going towards what actually keeps us safe, which is proper housing, such as night shift, which is free transportation. And that's where a lot of the change has been happening as we talk to community members, and that slowly could be used to combat the fear mongering that we see from NYPD. But it's a long fight, and politics are going to be politics, and we just got to keep like moving along.
One other thing that was said at the hearing that actually gave me the most like challenge in thinking about how to respond, so I'll just say it too, is that, you know, there obviously are NYPD officers who are undercover in gang and other criminal activities, and those folks are risking their lives for our safety every day. And I mean, this is not to, you know, deny the point about where our priorities should be more broadly, but like we've all seen the, you know, the crime dramas, and you like think about that officer who's so like, sure, like if the microphone for those officers are all like, you know, in their ears, you know, the catalog probably should not say some version of like, every officer who goes undercover is wearing a listening device in their left ear, you know? So like there's obviously ways of indicating the kinds of surveillance technology that are being used so that we can do the kinds of analyses that we want to be able to do to make sure that they are not discriminatory, that they're in the public interest, that they're being used in the right way, that would not expose an individual officer to harm. But that's another one that's just kind of like a good argument to see. If you want to block all of this and say we're just not going to do it, then, you know, a powerful argument to make is to say, you police reformers, you civil liberties defenders would be putting officers at risk of being exposed and killed by undercover criminal syndicates, which is not what we're looking to do. In case you were wondering, that's not.
Which also seems like an argument they've brought up to block everything from disciplinary record releases to the number of people who are arrested for fare evasion. Like every time we demand any data, we're told that it's going to put officers at risk. So maybe, you know, it's obviously something one wants to take seriously, but there is a bit of a Chicken Little dimension at this point.
Agreed. And I don't think there's any doubt that there's an ability to describe surveillance technologies in the ways that we need to have good public oversight in a way, right? Like it's true that we would not want a law that said every time an undercover officer is going somewhere, you should post on the internet who they are and where they're going. You know, like there would be things we could, I suppose, theoretically do that might, and this is not one of them.
And so I wanted to sort of look at how the Post Act connects to the broader ecosystem of reforms, because we know that there are bills pending at the city, state, and federal level that are trying to tackle everything from key fobs to facial recognition to the use of new forms of biometric surveillance in addition to facial rec. So could each of you talk about how you think Post Act, what role Post Act plays when added to those other reforms?
So I think for us, so right now on the state, and you guys could jump in on how, if I'm missing anyone. So there's like 3 bills that I remember. So there's like a Horleman and Walker bill that would make it unlawful for landlords to use facial recognition technology in residential buildings. There's another one that kind of prohibits biometric surveillance and creates like a task force to study the impact of it. And there's one by Senator Kavanaugh with there isn't the same as in the assembly that kind of puts a moratorium on using like biometric stuff in school grounds and creating like a commission to like study it. And I think post-act in New York kind of feel like it started off the foundation of those conversations of like, yes, there's like transparency around that, but there's a larger conversation around like, how are we actually using these things? What authority and how are we respecting communities' privacy? How is surveillance being used to like circumvent people's privacies and ability to just not be surveilled? And I think the Post Act kind of set the foundation for that, and now these bigger conversations are like happening about facial recognition tools. We're putting all these cameras in subways of like, what privacies do people have, and how is that being juxtaposed with the fact that we want to criminalize people, and that criminality is then being used to like justify the use of these facial recognition technologies. So how are we making these tools, but also how are we recognizing that that construct of criminality still exists, that construct of who gets to be surveilled, why, and like how that just kind of circumvents every form of logic, every form of privacy that a person has, because the state has deemed you a criminal, therefore it's okay to surveil you. And I think Post-Act kind of started that conversation for some spaces, and now we're in this like bigger space of like, what is the privacies we have? These facial recognition tools are massive. A lot of money is being spent into them to like purport this false sense of public safety. Like, what's happening? We like really need to like really have these conversations and like have community be involved with it. And I think that's kind of for me what Post-Act really for me jumped off like more of like community was having it, now like state council, now the state is having it. I think that's really important to like continue to have those conversations around these.
I think for me, the Post-Act fits into the broader conversation and push that people have been having about digital surveillance. And I think maybe one reason is that a lot of times we see technology developed for either the military or law enforcement, and then gradually it trickles down into commercial spaces and then private spaces. So we saw that happen with facial recognition, which is being used by landlords now to track people as they come in and out of their own homes. And I think that it brings broader communities into the conversation about digital surveillance. And so the Post-Act is one step to kind of just have a base level understanding of what's going on, because it's hard to mobilize people around something that's unknown. But as digital surveillance becomes more openly done and people see it, I think there's been broader momentum to have some kind of oversight, which is exactly what the Post-Act is trying to do.
I want to use this to like also take a step back and just reflect on, in a crowd of people who are often thinking in the very positive direction, how can we use data for good, to just like have a little conversation about what's the harm here, which we, is worth starting at. So, and we've talked about a few of them because there's a set of civil rights violations that I think kind of jump to people's minds if you're worried about this. If surveillance is targeted unfairly and in an unwarranted way at particular people, at, African American and Latino young men for stop-and-frisk, or for Muslim communities for surveillance, then we are violating people's civil rights and using state power against people in ways that are either free speech and First Amendment restricting in the form of Muslim surveillance, or freedom restricting in the, kind of physical freedom restricting in the form of stop and frisk. But it's worth like broadening that out a little and just like remembering, and I say this as someone who isn't someone who's like, I'm going to set all my privacy settings. Like, I kind of like it when my phone says, oh, you'll like this thing near here, or don't you remember this picture you took last time you were in this location? Like, we and people have different personal reactions to those things. I think some people are like, I can't stand that, I'm freaked out by it. And some people are like, oh, that's kind of cool. But the risks of harm we should just be mindful of. So if the NYPD has the ability to do extensive facial recognition and photographic activity, then like every time you go to a protest or at a public action, Like, is there some risk that like a picture's being taken of a whole crowd and then a database is being created that could recognize where you were at all those times that now exists somewhere? And that, like, yes, might be used if you ever wind up being charged with something, but might also be shared in ways that you don't know and don't have control of. And unless we're asking those questions, there's just all kinds of potential risks. Obviously, if it's being shared with ICE and you're undocumented, then the fact you should not lose your First Amendment right to go to a protest because facial recognition technology in a database exists that could be shared with ICE, and now your patterns and your movements can be tracked in ways that might leave you to be deported. But also, I made this joke before, and it really is true. Governor Cuomo, when they were shifting from Easy Pass, which was a form of kind of a certain kind of surveillance, to the pictures being taken, he really did make the comment like, yeah, we can recognize people by their ears, that the pictures are not just of your license plate, but they might. And so now, every place you go can be tracked, and real issues come up with that when those technologies are commercialized. So I'll just end here by saying, I think in terms of what it gets challenging to figure out what the right regulations are, and we have a long way to go in figuring out, and I'll use the issue of landlords as an example. It's a little hard, like banning facial recognition technology as a way of getting people into your home seems pretty straightforward to me. But key fobs are a smidge more complex, like there's reasons why key fobs are convenient. And we might say we want to ban them, or we might say we want to put controls on what can happen with the data about your comings and goings, and we're going to need to figure that out. I here have a bill I really love because it's like the most Luddite bill that I've ever introduced. My bill here, I have a bill that says every landlord will be required to give a key to their tenants, and it even defines like a key is a small metal object with teeth carved into it. It's like, and it's a funny bill because, there's reasons why technology can help us, but in this case, like the key is working, it gets you into your home, no one is complaining, there's a problem with keys, and if we could just keep the option that everyone has a key, that doesn't answer all these other questions because there's still cameras in a lot of our homes, and are you being tracked? But it's like a nice, how we do legislation and rulemaking in the context of the expansion of technology. We've got a long way to go, and we're always going to be behind the folks who design and sell that technology. Like the main reason landlords are doing it is because it's being marketed to them. Hey, this is like a great, cool new thing. So the Post Act, as like a foundation, says, okay, as we are going to be figuring out what other kinds of regulations we need to have appropriate public safety, a basic place to start has to be when the state uses them, it discloses what's being used so that people out there can like understand what the consequences are and start providing the kind of both public oversight, like city council hearing, but also the form of sort of civic tech engagement that so many of you are involved in that helps us sometimes solve problems and actually take steps forward, hopefully like that dangerous vehicle abatement program that'll save people's lives, and sometimes to say, there is a problem here. This technology, is likely to misrecognize people, especially if they're people of color, and we can only do that if we know what's being used.
Yeah, exactly. It's very hard to know what regulations to pass if you don't know what's being done in the first place. So I have a bunch more questions, but I want to leave some time for audience Q&A. So if you have is there anyone who has a question they'd like to? Yeah. And please make sure to turn on your microphone.
On the Clearview AI example, it didn't seem to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, it didn't seem like the Post Act would really be that helpful in stopping the issues that the NYPD came up with in terms of how they're actually implementing that facial recognition. And then another question is, I would imagine the vast majority of the technology that they're using is not being developed in-house by the NYPD, and they have other companies like that are being contracted out to do this. What about instead of requiring the NYPD to disclose that information, to instead come at it from the other way and go to the contractors to try to, get some information on how the technology is being used or what the technology is?
So I want to take the first part myself with regard to Clearview. I actually do believe that the Post Act would be helpful because those officers wouldn't be permitted by department guidelines to utilize that product until the department had issued a policy on use and retention of the data. And so that actually would act as it would require the department to actually monitor how these tools are being used by officers more effectively than they are already. But on the developer side, would anyone like to take that or add to the Clearview point?
Sure. I think that one thing we've seen when it comes to the NYPD buying outside tech is that there are NDAs that go both ways. So that's something that Post Act wouldn't address, but it is a barrier to groups like ours getting information under Freedom of Information law requests. So I think that could be a good avenue to pursue, but I think that it might be difficult because I think developers, obviously, they have very lucrative contracts with the NYPD, and if that's a condition that NYPD puts on doing business with them, I think it could be hard, but yeah, I think it could be a good avenue to apply pressure.
And so the question was, if the NYPD isn't being honest about how they're using this technology in the first place, what's the point of asking these questions to the PD? And I would say that that's where the auditing process with the Office of the Inspector General doing a compliance audit on the privacy policies and whether they're being adhered to, that is a really important part of this because well, I was going to say trust but verify, but with the NYPD, I would say neither trust, but still need to verify.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we pass the Post Act, at first, there is the comptroller keeps a contracts database, so we know some minimal things about, the name of a contractor and how much money is spent in a lot of cases. There can be a lot in there that we don't know. I think if the law is passed, the PD will provide the catalog, and then you got to go from there and start asking more questions and dig in on lots of things, and you want the audit to make sure it's being followed. But I don't know. To me, it's like that's the first step of what public oversight means. Is that's a government agency using our tax dollars to procure a set of tools, and we need, in the first order, to know what they are and be able to ask questions about them. And you can't, you got to take that seriously and do it. You can't, they're going to be secretive and not tell us, so can we go around and get, I'm not saying we shouldn't also look other places, and obviously researchers do, but that's just a fundamental building block that we need to insist on and move forward with, even though we know we're going to have some challenges.
So we probably have time for one or two more questions. Yep.
So let me preface this by saying I'm generally anti-surveillance. So you mentioned earlier that there's some worries from the police department about giving a roadmap to the perpetrators, so to speak. And there's definitely an argument to be had about whenever people know what technology you're using, it is easier for them to circumvent it or hack into it and use it themselves. So I was wondering if you guys had thought of arguments against that, or how you can kind of fight NYPD in that sense. Does that make sense?
I would say, so since the Post Act was introduced in 2017, other cities have passed similar types of transparency bills. So to the fear that there's a roadmap out there, those cities might not have exactly the same technologies as the NYPD, but they definitely have some of the same ones, and that information has already been released. The federal government, like the FBI, they release privacy impact assessments on their technologies, and no one has argued that that makes people less safe. So I think the requirements of the Post Act are very high level, and I don't think that they would give someone the tools that they would need to circumvent the technology.
I mean, if you told people there is a camera at the intersection of Broadway and Lafayette, then like maybe they would go commit crimes not at the intersection of Broadway and Lafayette, you know? But if you say we use cameras, you are not giving anyone a roadmap to where they should or shouldn't conduct criminal activity.
Well,
And I would add that we've had wiretaps in existence since, the 19 teens, and simply knowing that wiretaps exist for over a century hasn't meant that they stop working. And so while, part of the way the Post Act is designed is to require only the high-level information that's necessary to assess the privacy impact without requiring disclosure of source code, methods, or things that would allow for circumvention more effectively.
Would the Post Act also cover spending by the New York City Police Foundation, which acts as a sort of a slush fund for the police to do things that the City Council hasn't authorized or hasn't funded?
Yes. I'm very happy you asked that because it talks about any tool that the NYPD uses, even if it's being paid for by the foundation. We only have a couple minutes left, so I wanted to give everyone a chance for closing thoughts. But first, I just wanted to shamelessly plug that we do have a petition ongoing where we've gotten more than 370 signatures already, calling on the City Council to call a vote on the Post Act. And you can access that petition and more background information at postact.org, postact.org. So for any closing thoughts?
Oh, are we starting from each? Oh, okay. I guess my closing thoughts is, for BYP 100, I started to work with Albert on the Post Act in my old job, and I think I support the work in terms of just having this bare minimum regulatory and transparency. But for us at BYP 100, our stance will always just be ban the use of surveillance technologies. And for people in this room who are able to create these technologies and able to make these things, I think it's always important to ask the question the council members are asking, is it really pushing forward safety or is it pushing forward surveillance? And when you're doing it, where each racial group on that conversation and that lens that you're using, right? Black people have historically just been surveilled and monitored. So for us, data is a touchy subject. It's a harmful subject for us. For other communities, it's the same thing, whereas for white people, it may be a different context of oh, this is kind of good because that harm isn't there. So it's always important to as you're making these tools, as you're moving forward in the policy work of this, to let's think about where each racial group or each identity group is on the scale and in this conversation around data. And to always go to where it's invested in the well-being of individuals and communities versus criminalizing people. And yeah.
I would say unchecked police surveillance threatens our basic democracy, our ability to get together with other people, to practice our religion, to get involved in different activism. And I think it's really important that we're having this conversation. And I want to thank you guys all for being here. I encourage you to call your city council members to express your support for the Post Act and to sign the petition, because it's really important that the city council members hear from you, and call on Corey Johnson to call a vote on the Post Act.
And I don't always love that thing where the elected official calls on people to provide more pressure, because that seems like a cop-out, but I am going to do it here. I'm embarrassed that we have not moved forward on these bills, which when were introduced were cutting edge. If we had moved then, New York City would have been taking proactive early steps to try to shine a spotlight here and have appropriate public oversight. And, I have a lot of respect for Councilmember Gorodnick, so he engaged in really, at least good faith, maybe even more than good faith, efforts to negotiate with the administration and the police department to reach an agreement. And that was worth spending a little time on, but we are just far past the point of reasonable in those conversations. Now we're in the second term that bill has been introduced and had its hearing, and we should have already passed it. And we need more, this is one of those issues that when the New York Times has that thing that shows everyone's cell phone is being tracked for one day, people are like, oh my God, our cell phones are being tracked, did you know? And then it kind of goes back to more quiet. And you know, it's going to take some sustained public pressure to get us to pass this this law. So I do hope you will provide it. I will certainly keep working internally, but we're past the point where it's reasonable for us to have passed this law.
All right. Well, thank you all, and thank you all for attending. Okay.